I wish I had never let Fiona, my husband's female best friend, move in during her divorce. In doing so, I uncovered their deep, unspoken bond, and ultimately, it destroyed my marriage. I'm 28, female, and I've been married to my husband, 30, for 4 years. We tied the knot after dating for 3. Our relationship had always been pretty normal, except for one thing, his relationship with Fiona. Fiona was his childhood neighbor. They were inseparable, and I mean inseparable. From daycare, kindergarten, middle school, and high school, to even college, same campus, just different departments, they had been a constant in each other's lives. This bond, one I could never forget, was a constant presence between us. They'd only drifted apart once they started their respective careers. That's when I met him. Fiona, as he always called her, was their first, long before I came into the picture. Fiona once told me, half in jest, that I was the third woman in my husband's life. His mother was first, she came second, and I was third. She said it like a joke, but I always wondered if there was a kernel of truth in her words. I've always had this feeling that Fiona didn't like me, that she saw me as competition. I'm not imagining it. From the start, she made her opinions known. When my husband introduced her to me early in our relationship, she immediately made fun of how much makeup I was wearing. "You don't need to impress me," she said, and that was just the beginning. Over time, it didn't stop. Fiona would regularly take digs at me about my makeup, my clothes, anything that could make me feel small. The compliments? Backhanded. She once looked me dead in the eye and told me my husband's type was dumb blonde. I'm blonde. You could imagine the kind of woman I'm dealing with. I tried talking to my husband about it multiple times. I told him I didn't feel right about Fiona. But he brushed it off every single time. "You'll warm up to her," he said. "She's just blunt, it's her thing." He kept excusing her behavior, painting her as someone who just didn't filter her words. She wasn't mean, she was just honest. I should have listened to my gut. The way he kept putting her above everyone else, making excuses for her, should have been my first red flag. But back then, I thought it didn't matter. He was perfect in every other way. He was smart, charming, funny, the perfect guy. I thought, I can deal with Fiona. I wanted to be with him, and he made it clear he loved me. So, I put up with her. I tried to ignore Fiona over time, not letting her get under my skin. Then, something changed. She met Eddie, a man she connected with on a dating app. Within a year, they were engaged. She was over the moon, and Eddie seemed equally smitten. Despite their obvious chemistry, I still believed that rushing into marriage after such a short time wasn't wise. They hadn't even been living together long enough to seriously consider it. But Fiona and I weren't friends. I wasn't about to tell her my concerns, especially knowing how she would react. So, I kept quiet. I did talk to my husband about it, hoping he would say something to her, nudge her towards being more cautious. But instead, he went on and on about how great it was that they were both engaged around the same time. He even talked about the possibility of a joint wedding. That idea was never going to happen, so I shut it down immediately. Thankfully, Fiona didn't push for it. She married Eddie about a month after we did. At first, everything was perfect. But that was before everything came crashing down. 5 months ago, Fiona confided in my husband. She told him that she and Eddie had been trying to get pregnant for months, but it wasn't working. They were about to start fertility tests. But then, the devastating news came. Fiona was infertile. And that's when things started unraveling for her. Eddie, instead of being supportive, made the decision to divorce her. He couldn't live with a woman who couldn't give him the family he wanted. The decision was harsh, cruel, and honestly, I felt for Fiona. She had loved him. She still loved him. After that, Fiona's visits to our home became more frequent. I tried to be understanding, seeing how heartbroken she was. My husband, of course, was the only one she could rely on. She would come over crying, and he would comfort her. It was hard to be angry at someone in that much pain. I felt sympathy for her, and I knew she had really loved Eddie. As things began to spiral even further for her, Fiona began struggling even more with the settlement process. Seeing Eddie again for their legal meetings only made it worse. She fell deeper into despair, and that's when my husband asked if she could move in with us for a while, to help her through it. "Being around us makes her feel sane again," he said. How could I say no? I regretted it the moment I opened the door to let her in. Not only was she critical of everything I did, but she also seemed to get away with it, simply because she was so depressed. She didn't like the food I made, the way the house was decorated, nothing seemed to please her. The moment I realized what had been happening in my own home, I couldn't believe it. My husband had moved most of his belongings from our bedroom to the guest room where Fiona had been staying. He'd done it while I was at work, returning home early to set up this new arrangement. When I walked in, the sight of them together, still moving his things, left me speechless. I was confused, lost, and I needed answers. I asked to speak to him privately, but instead of being concerned, he said I could talk to him in front of Fiona, that it wouldn't matter. And that's when I saw it, the first genuine smile I'd seen on Fiona's face in weeks. It sent a chill down my spine. I asked him why he was moving his things. He looked at me, so casually, as though this was the most normal thing in the world. "I'm going to be staying with Fiona," he said, like it was no big deal. My world spun. I stood there, dumbfounded, as the reality of his words sank in. I asked him, why? Why was he moving in with her? His answer, so calm, felt like a slap to my face. Fiona had been having panic attacks, he said. She needed someone with her during the night, someone to comfort her when she was overwhelmed with her divorce. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I instantly told him it was absurd, that this was insane, and I couldn't accept it. But he didn't hear me. Instead, he brushed it off with the same tired excuse he'd used for years. "She's like a sister to me," he said. "You have nothing to worry about." Both of them smiled at me, as if that smile could erase the tension, as if their grinning faces could somehow make this situation acceptable. It was so wrong. I was seething inside, my blood boiling with fury, but I couldn't let it show. Not in the way they expected. No, instead, I did the one thing that could throw them off balance. I smiled back. I gave them my most understanding smile and said, "I understand, it's fine." He looked so sure, so smug, as if he knew I'd accept it. But he had no idea what I was about to do. As they continued setting up the room, I calmly walked back to our bedroom and pulled out the deed to our house. My father had given me this house as a gift when I got my first job, so it was solely in my name. The house was mine, legally and emotionally. I walked back into the guest room, holding the deed. "Are you done unpacking?" I asked sweetly. When they told me they were, I didn't hesitate. "Well, start packing again," I said, my voice suddenly cold. "Because you're about to be out of here." For a moment, my husband stood there, confused, until I waved the deed in front of him. "This house is mine. And neither of you will live here any longer. Not while you're disrespecting me like this." He laughed, thinking I was joking, but when I didn't join in, his smile faltered. "You can't be serious," he said. "You can't just kick us out." "Oh, I can," I told him, my voice firm. "And I am. I'm actively kicking both of you out." I was done. Done with the betrayal. Done with Fiona and her endless tears. She was nothing more than a sobbing wreck, always clinging to him. I couldn't take it anymore. I told them exactly how I felt. "If you can't live without each other, then stick to each other," I said. "Stay together. You've ruined enough lives already. Mine included." That's when the fight really escalated. He started accusing me of being insecure, of always being jealous of Fiona. He blamed me for their bond, for his loyalty to her. I didn't even argue. Yes, I was insecure, but it wasn't about her. It was about them. Their relationship wasn't normal, and I had had enough. Fiona cried. Of course, she did. She accused me of being evil, of being jealous, right up until the moment she left. I didn't say a word. I didn't have the energy to fight them anymore. I just wanted them gone. I thought that once they were gone, my troubles would finally end. But no. It only got worse. The flood of messages started pouring in. Friends, people who had never once cared about the state of my marriage, suddenly felt the need to weigh in. They all told me I was overreacting. "It's just panic attacks," they said. "He's just being a good friend to Fiona. Why can't you see that?" They said I was making it all about me, about my insecurities. It was obvious my husband had put them up to it. The messages were too similar. I tried to ignore it, but then his family started reaching out too. They all said the same thing, that I was heartless, that I didn't deserve him, and that I was terrible for kicking Fiona out when she was clearly suffering. They even told me I wasn't good enough for him, that I never had been. Deep down, I had always known they thought that way. Which is exactly why I was insecure. I had been flooded with anger, frustration, and doubt. Everyone was against me. Friends, family, they all seemed to believe I was overreacting. I couldn't take it anymore. So, I blocked them all. Every single one. It was the only way to find any peace, to silence the voices that were only concerned with my husband and Fiona and their feelings. They didn't care about me. They didn't care what I was going through, and frankly, I didn't think they ever would. I was ready to file for divorce. I had made up my mind. But then, a message came through. It was from him, using a different number. My heart sank as I read his words. He still wanted to come back, he said. He wanted me to apologize. He told me once again that Fiona was like a sister to him, and that I had misunderstood everything. He insisted he had no romantic feelings for her, that it was only platonic, sibling-like love. The love he had for me, he reminded me, was the romantic kind. He said he couldn't imagine his life without me. The thought of losing me was devastating for him. I was still reeling, but he wasn't done. He told me that leaving was a mistake, that I had reacted too harshly, that I had misjudged the situation. He asked me to think things through, to cool down and consider the consequences of what I was planning. He didn't want me to make a decision I'd regret for the rest of my life. And if I was willing to apologize, he was ready to fix things. We could both apologize, he said, and move forward, together. His words left me paralyzed. I didn't know how to feel. Was I being too harsh? Was it worth it, to get a divorce over this? I wasn't sure anymore. It was so hard to know if I could believe him, if I could trust that he truly saw me as his priority. Maybe Fiona was just a sister to him, after all. Maybe I had misunderstood everything. But as I sat with his message, doubt gnawed at me. Was I wrong? Should I just forgive him? I didn't know what to do. Update. Reading through the comments on my original post was an eye-opener. I realized, finally, how blind I had been. The criticism, harsh as it was, made me see that I had been sleepwalking through my own marriage. I should have dealt with his friendship with Fiona much earlier, should have set boundaries before things got out of hand. Maybe that would have led to us breaking up, but at least it would have been on my terms, not this mess where Fiona was still pulling the strings. I had allowed him to get away with so much. How? I loved him, maybe still do, but I had let him manipulate me. For years, he convinced me that his relationship with Fiona was normal, that my jealousy and insecurity were the real problem. He gaslighted me into thinking that I was the one who had the issue. It wasn't until the moment he tried to stay with her that I realized I had reached my breaking point. That was the final straw. My parents were supportive. They thought I was making the right decision by filing for divorce. Honestly, they were right. There was no way we could bounce back from this. He couldn't take back the hurtful things he'd said, and I didn't think he'd break his bond with Fiona for me. Days passed, and I hadn't responded to him. I didn't even know where they were now, and I didn't want to know. Part of me was terrified of finding out. But another part of me knew I needed to move on. I deserved someone who would always put me first. That was never going to be him. I was a fool for holding on to the hope that things would change. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd put me above Fiona. But now I knew the truth. He never would. It was time to walk away. I had filed for divorce. The papers were being served, and in a couple of days, it would be official. Update. It's been a week since my husband was served, and I thought that would be the end of it. But no. Last night, he showed up. I didn't expect him to visit, especially after everything that had happened. After I kicked him out, humiliated him, I thought he'd stay away. But he came by, needing to collect some things, and he also wanted to talk. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat there, staring at him, waiting to see if he would finally say something that made sense. He told me he wasn't contesting the divorce, but he was disappointed. He thought I was giving up on our marriage over something so petty. He sat across from me, his eyes looking at me with a mixture of hurt and frustration. I stayed silent, listening to him. I've only ever loved you, he said. I can't believe you'd think I'd cheat on you, especially with Fiona. Then, he told me that everyone was upset with my decision. His parents, his friends, they were all disappointed in me. His mother, he said, even wanted to speak to me in person after he was served. But he stopped her. He said he respected my choice and didn't want to push me into a corner by having people talk to me. It took everything in me to keep my composure. This coming from the same man who had orchestrated all those messages from our friends and family, telling me I was horrible, heartless, that I needed to forgive him. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I reminded him of what he had done, how he had manipulated everyone into sending me those messages, trying to force me into submission. He looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. He tried to deny it, saying those messages came from people on their own, that he had nothing to do with it. But I wasn't fooled. I pulled up the texts. They were too identical, too rehearsed. I knew someone had told them what to say. The only person who stood to benefit from it was him. And now, he was trying to pretend like none of it had happened. I wasn't buying it. The tension in the air thickened as he tried to steer the conversation away from what really mattered. He shifted, suddenly solemn, and began talking about how hard the past few days had been for him. He spoke about our marriage ending, and how devastating it was to face the reality that it was all falling apart. Sitting there on the couch, his face crumpled with emotion, he cried, tears streaming down as he said, "Life won't be the same without you." I watched him, unmoved. His words, his tears, they felt hollow. Was I supposed to feel sorry for him? He had been the one who pushed me to this point, and now, with his act of desperation, he expected sympathy. I couldn't bear it. When he said he wished there was something he could do to make things right, I spoke the words that had been building up in my mind. "I might reconsider the divorce," I said, "if you could promise me that you would never see Fiona again." The silence that followed was thick with disbelief. He froze. His crying stopped instantly, and we just stared at each other, waiting for the other to speak. To be clear, I had no intention of staying with him, no matter how he responded. Even if he had promised to cut ties with her, I would never trust him again. But I needed to hear it, to see his reaction, and that was all. And just as I had expected, he didn't give me the answer I wanted. Instead, he started arguing, again, about Fiona, how she was his oldest friend, like a sister to him. He couldn't abandon her, not when she was going through so much. But where was that same concern when it came to me, his wife? I was the one he had promised to stay with, to love, in sickness and health. Yet, there he was, choosing her over me once again. My patience thinned as he went on, listing all the reasons he couldn't sever ties with Fiona. I cut him off, stopping him mid-sentence. "This is exactly why I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, unwavering. "You've been given a choice between your wife and Fiona, and you chose her. So don't you dare tell me I didn't give you a chance, or that I'm overreacting. I was right all along." His mouth opened, but no words came. He didn't have anything to say. So, quietly, he left, and I was left to wait for the legal proceedings to unfold. Update. It had been weeks since that conversation. Today, we met in court for the first time. The process was going to take at least a few months. The waiting period in our state was mandatory. But even as we sat in the courtroom, my husband still wasn't ready to let go. After the hearing, he approached me, his voice low, almost pleading. "I'll wait for these months if that's what it takes," he said, "to make you come back to me." I couldn't believe it. It had been weeks since I had last spoken to him, and now, here he was, still trying to win me back. I thought the divorce was final, that there was nothing left to say. But he still had words, and I had to listen to them. "So, are you still living with Fiona?" I asked, my tone flat. He didn't respond. Silence stretched between us, heavy and awkward. I rolled my eyes and turned toward the car, ready to leave it all behind. But then he spoke again, and my heart sank. He told me that Fiona couldn't go back to her parents because her mother was unbearable, blaming Fiona for the divorce. That was why she had been staying with us, then with his parents. I couldn't even summon sympathy. Fiona? The woman who had been the cause of all this? The woman who had made me feel insignificant, pushed me to the edge, and ultimately tore my marriage apart? I wasn't about to feel sorry for her. I snapped back from the car, my words sharp. She has other friends, plenty of them. Unmarried ones who would have gladly taken her in. It's not about her, it's about you. You were too blind to see how strange your friendship was with her, and now it's cost us everything. Our argument escalated from there. But in that moment, something clicked in me. The realization hit like a slap. I had been reconsidering the divorce, second-guessing myself. What a fool I had been. My marriage had drained me, my friends, my sanity, my money. And Fiona had lived here for free, all while I paid the price. Now, I'd have to pay for a lawyer too. It was madness. How had I let it go on for so long? How had I been so willing to forgive him? I had loved him. But he hadn't loved me enough to see that moving Fiona in was a huge mistake. He had refused to acknowledge it, to admit how much damage he had done. His stubbornness had cost him everything. And now, I knew it was time to move on. I had made the right choice, no matter how hard it was. Update. Then, something completely unexpected happened. My husband came back into my life, but not in the way I thought he would. A few days ago, we met, and I hadn't anticipated hearing from him anytime soon. But there he was, showing up at my door again. He was frantic, like he couldn't wait another moment to speak to me. When I opened the door, he barged in, his energy electric. I thought he was here to argue, to demand something. I even considered calling the cops to get him off my property. But then, to my shock, he broke down in tears. This time, they were real, raw, and unfiltered. I dropped everything I was doing. It's impossible not to respond to someone in pain, even if that someone was the cause of my pain. I couldn't just turn my back on him. I'm only human. So, I stayed with him, waited for him to calm down enough to speak. He told me he had taken a day off work. The divorce had left him feeling lost, hopeless. He was spiraling. And then, Fiona came into his room to comfort him, but things took a turn. She started flirting with him, something she had never done before. He pushed her away, told her to stop, but she kept going. Then, she tried to cuddle with him. That was when he snapped. He finally saw what I had been trying to warn him about all along. Fiona had always wanted more. She had been scheming, trying to get him, even when he thought she was just a friend. Their argument escalated, and Fiona accused him of leading her on all these years, only to marry me. She called him a cheater, packed her things, and left, moving back in with her parents. Now, he was here, apologizing, finally admitting that I had been right all along. "I'm sorry," he said, voice trembling. "I took you for granted. I don't deserve someone like you." I listened, and for a moment, I almost believed him. But not enough to change anything. The divorce was still happening. But at least, for the first time, I didn't feel like the villain in this story. We cleared the air, and we both acknowledged the truth. I had been right. But that wasn't enough to make me stay. We're still getting divorced, but we're trying to end things on better terms. I just hope that, one day, he truly understands everything that led to this point.